My name is Margaret, and I'm 57 years old. When I was 15, my mother was fired and humiliated in front of a crowd for a crime she didn't commit. I stood there, powerless, while the richest woman in town called her a thief. I swore I'd never forget that day, and I didn't. Because 15 years later, that same woman, her pearls, her pride, her perfect smile came to me, begging for a partnership. Only this time, she didn't know the woman she was pleading with was the daughter of the seamstress she destroyed. Time has softened my face, lined it with experience, but it hasn't erased the memories that shaped me. Sometimes, when I close my eyes, I can still smell the faint mix of soap and fabric starch that clung to my mother's clothes. Clara was her name, a woman of quiet strength and endless grace. After my father passed away when I was just 8, she became both my anchor and my sail. We lived in a tiny cottage at the edge of town, where the walls were thin, but the love was thick enough to hold us together. My mother worked for the Henderson family, the wealthiest people in our town. Their mansion sat atop the hill like a crown, glimmering under the sun as if mocking those of us below. The Hendersons had everything: influence, money, and a cruel kind of charm that made people obey them. My mother spent her days sewing gowns for Mrs. Henderson and her friends, her nimble fingers stitching their luxury while she herself wore the same faded dress for years. She never complained. She always said, "Dignity doesn't come from what you wear, Maggie, but how you hold yourself." Despite her kindness, the Hendersons treated her like she was invisible. I used to sit by the sewing machine, handing her threads while Mrs. Henderson criticized her work. "Too plain, Clara," she'd sigh, sipping tea. "Try not to make it look so poor." My mother would bow her head, murmuring apologies that made my blood burn even at that young age. I couldn't understand why someone so gentle had to endure so much disrespect. But she'd always tell me, "Patience, sweetheart. The world remembers kindness, not anger." Everything changed one afternoon at the Hendersons' charity gala. It was the grandest event of the year, and my mother had been asked to help with final fittings. The hall was dazzling, chandeliers brighter than stars, laughter floating like perfume. I tagged along, too young to grasp the politics of wealth, just eager to be near my mother. She moved among the guests quietly, making adjustments to gowns and suits, invisible but indispensable. Then, out of nowhere, Mrs. Henderson's shrill voice cut through the music. "Where is my sapphire brooch?" she demanded. Guests froze, turning to watch her. My mother looked up, startled, hands trembling slightly. I haven't seen it, ma'am," she stammered. But Mrs. Henderson wasn't listening. Her eyes, sharp as glass, landed on my mother's modest blouse, and she sneered. "You're the only one who's been near my dressing table today." I remember the hush that fell over the room. My heart pounded as my mother shook her head, her voice breaking. "I would never take anything, ma'am. You know me." Mrs. Henderson scoffed. "Do I? Or have I been too kind, letting you near my things all these years?" The crowd began whispering, their eyes shifting toward my mother with judgment. Someone laughed, a small, cruel laugh that echoed in my chest like thunder. The brooch was later found beneath a chair cushion, but Mrs. Henderson never apologized. Instead, she fired my mother on the spot, declaring that she could no longer trust people like her. My mother stood there in silence, her cheeks pale but her posture straight, refusing to cry in front of them. I wish she had yelled, defended herself, done something, but she didn't. She simply gathered her tools, turned toward the door, and left with me at her side. Outside, in the cold night air, I saw tears finally fall down her cheeks. "Let it go, Maggie," she whispered, her voice shaking. "Some people are born cruel, but we don't have to become like them." I wanted to believe her, but something inside me cracked that night. Watching her dignity trampled, seeing laughter replace justice, it burned into my soul. I didn't know it then, but that moment would define every choice I made thereafter. As we walked home, I looked back at the glowing mansion. The people inside were still laughing, unaware they'd just ignited a fire that would never go out. That night, lying in our small bed, I swore to myself that one day, I'd make them regret what they did. I didn't know how or when, but I would rise high enough that they'd have to look up to see me. What I didn't realize then was that revenge would become the compass of my entire life. My mother never spoke of that day again, but the way she moved through our small house told me more than any words could. She had become careful with her smiles and deliberate with her steps, as though she were trying to measure out dignity one quiet motion at a time. After the gala, she stopped humming while she stitched, and the little jokes she once made over the kettle grew rarer, replaced by a soft, steady silence that settled between us like dust. I watched her put on the same faded apron each morning and felt anger rise and fall inside me like the tide, sometimes barely noticeable, sometimes crashing with a force that left me breathless. There were nights when I would find her at the kitchen table, hands folded over a scrap of fabric, staring at nothing at all. I wanted to shake her awake and force her to scream at them, to demand an apology, to refuse the quiet that the Hendersons had imposed on her. But she would only turn to me and say, in that small voice she used for everything tender and painful, "Let me be, Maggie. There are better battles than shouting." I learned then that her strength was not for show. It was private, like a room kept locked against unnecessary cruelty. I grew up faster than my friends, not because I wanted to, but because necessity pulled me forward. School became my refuge and my weapon. I took every book I could find and held it between my palms like something holy. While others chased small pleasures, I took on jobs after classes, folding newspapers, cleaning at the bakery before dawn, running errands until my feet ached. I did not tell my classmates why I worked so hard. It felt foolish to explain the fuel that fed my ambition, and I wanted no pity. Each pay envelope that slipped into my hand felt like repayment to a mother who had given everything and been given contempt in return. When the Henderson mansion's silhouette rose on the horizon as I walked home, my chest tightened. The sight of their pristine windows and manicured grounds was a silent insult that I absorbed and filed away. Anger became a steady companion, but it was tempered by a plan that was slowly taking shape in the back of my mind. Education. I studied harder than anyone else, not out of vanity but out of strategy. I learned the language of spreadsheets and balance sheets the way others learned a second language. I practiced negotiation on the heads of small school projects and devoured books on leadership the way some people devoured novels. Where my peers saw numbers, I saw power, the capacity to shape decisions, to hold influence over fortunes, to change the lives of people who had been treated like my mother. Teachers took to calling on me in class, and I answered because confidence builds on small victories. When I applied for scholarships, I imagined them as bridges out of that town. When the acceptance letter came from a business college 2 towns away, I remember standing in our kitchen with the paper trembling in my hand, while my mother's eyes shone in a light I had not seen in years. She cried the day I left, not from sorrow alone, but from pride and fear braided together. She pressed a folded handkerchief into my palm and whispered, "Make it count," and I promised her I would. College did not romanticize anything for me. It sharpened my edges. I kept my head down, taking in every lecture, every case study, every late-night discussion that might teach me even the smallest advantage. I learned the mechanics of business risk assessment, mergers, the slow art of building trust with people who thought their names were guarantees of quality. I watched how other women who came from backgrounds like mine were often elbowed aside, and I vowed to be the one who would not be. The classrooms taught me more than balance sheets. They taught me patience and timing. Revenge, I realized in those long nights over textbooks, did not need the roar of scandal or the taste of vindictiveness to be effective. It could be quiet and measured, a series of small, precise choices that accumulated into undeniable consequence. My anger became less about spectacle and more about design. I began sketching plans in a battered journal I kept tucked beneath my textbooks, titling the first page in a swift, cramped hand, "For Mother." The pages filled with ideas ranging from saving small sums to investing in properties, from learning the legal language that wrapped itself around businesses, to drafting a strategy for acquiring companies at the right moment. I wrote names of mentors I admired, companies I wanted to study, and small ethical rules I would not break. It surprised me how much calm thinking could coexist inside the same chest that burned with old wounds. I did internships during summer months, often taking positions that others overlooked but that taught me the logistics of commerce. The paperwork that invisibly determines who rises and who falls. Each experience added another stitch in the fabric of a plan that wanted to be more than payback. It wanted it to be justice, delivered in a way that could not be dismissed as cruelty. My mother wrote letters I could only read when I was alone. Thin sheets on which she prayed for my strength and thanked me for the little things I brought home. She worried that my pursuit might change me. Sometimes I worried too. There were moments of small, dangerous pride when I imagined standing over the Hendersons with a ledger in hand and hearing them beg. There were other moments when I wondered if becoming like them in any way would mean losing what had been sacred about our family. Those doubts did not disappear, but they became part of the strategy, a compass that kept me from crossing certain lines. I promised myself I would never humiliate to satisfy a wound. I would reclaim dignity without resorting to the pettiness that had wounded my mother. By the time I was ready to graduate, the sketches in my journal had evolved into a sequence of moves: education, strategic employment, targeted investments, and a patient accumulation of influence. I had mentors who believed in my vision, colleagues who respected my competence, and the quiet confidence of someone who had walked through too much to be intimidated by moneyed names. I knew then that destroying the Henderson legacy did not mean simply taking what they had. It meant dismantling the quiet cruelty that allowed them to assume their right to belittle others. My plan was not a shout into the night. It was a long, steady march forward. Each step measured so that when the time came, there would be no mistaking the purpose behind it. What I could not foresee, even as I closed the college door behind me and clutched my diploma like a passport, was how much the pursuit itself would change me, and how complex the price of such silent vengeance could become. My first real job came not from luck but from persistence. I must have sent out 50 applications before one small investment firm in the city called me back. The office wasn't glamorous, just a cluster of beige cubicles under buzzing fluorescent lights, but to me, it was a doorway. My position was simple: assistant to an overworked analyst named Carl who treated deadlines like battlefields. The long hours didn't bother me. The paperwork, the endless spreadsheets, the calculations that blurred numbers into clouds, I absorbed them all. Every late night, every tired morning, felt like a brick in the foundation I was building. I reminded myself constantly that I wasn't there just for a paycheck. I was there to learn how power worked. In those early months, I watched the wealthy move like a separate species. They spoke in numbers that could buy small houses and argued over margins that could fund a family for a year. What fascinated me wasn't the money itself, but the confidence that came with it, the quiet certainty that the world would rearrange itself to suit them. I studied their mannerisms, how they never apologized for ambition, how they made requests like commands but wrapped them in charm. I realized that if I wanted to rise in this world, I couldn't cling to the humility my mother had worn as armor. I had to learn their language, not desperation, but authority. I started emulating the patterns I observed. In meetings, I spoke less but made my words count. I learned how to make my silence powerful, how to let others fill the space I left. Slowly, they began listening when I did speak. I took initiative drafting reports before being asked, anticipating questions, fixing problems quietly before anyone else noticed. Within 2 years, my name was circulating beyond that cramped office. I wasn't just the girl from nowhere anymore. I was Margaret Clark, the assistant who made numbers behave. My boss started relying on me for advice, and clients began requesting my input. Promotions followed faster than anyone expected, and though people congratulated me for my discipline and intelligence, I knew my drive came from something darker, deeper, a promise I had made long ago to a woman who had been humiliated in front of strangers. As I climbed, I never let that memory soften. I didn't want revenge to consume me, but I also didn't want to forget. The Hendersons and their kind had built their comfort on the backs of women like my mother, women who stitched beauty for others while living invisible lives. I decided my success would be the correction to that imbalance. Behind every achievement, I kept the same quiet mantra: this is for her. My purpose gave me stamina that others mistook for ambition. I learned how to blend both into something unstoppable. When my savings finally began to grow, I turned my attention back to the place I had once escaped. My hometown was still small and slow, caught in the rhythm of gossip and Sunday markets, but I saw opportunity there. Real estate prices were low, people were leaving in search of jobs. I started buying small properties, an abandoned tailor shop, a neglected cafe, a row of cottages near the railway. Each deed I signed felt like reclaiming a fragment of my mother's dignity, like taking back ground that had once been denied to us. I fixed those buildings, turned them into rentals, and hired locals to manage them. The money wasn't huge at first, but the satisfaction was immense. The first time I saw one of the old Henderson servants moving into one of my renovated apartments, I felt something close to poetic justice. She didn't know I owned the place, and I didn't tell her. Some victories, I decided, were best enjoyed quietly. By then, my confidence had solidified into something that even the city's elite noticed. Invitations to charity galas began arriving, ironic, given how much those events used to sting me. I attended them occasionally, not for the champagne or the music, but to observe the faces of people who once would have dismissed me. None of them recognized the young girl from that night. And I intended to keep it that way, at least for now. After 6 years at the firm, I took the boldest risk of my life. I left. My colleagues thought I was mad to abandon a stable, high-paying job, but I had outgrown it. I wanted something of my own, something that carried my mother's name into every room it entered. That's how Clara Holdings was born, a modest investment firm at first. Run from a rented office with second-hand furniture and a staff of 3. The name drew questions. Why Clara? They'd ask, and I would smile softly. She taught me the value of work. They assumed she was a mentor, maybe a former executive. None guessed she was a seamstress who once stitched hems for people who would have never said her name with respect. I built the company differently. I hired single mothers first, women who came to interviews with tired eyes and nervous hands, women who reminded me of my mother trying to hold her composure while the world dismissed her. I offered flexible hours, childcare support, and training programs. The corporate world scoffed at my policies, but within a year, productivity soared. My employees were loyal because they were seen, because they mattered. That became my secret weapon: compassion where others offered control. Clients loved it. Investors admired it. Slowly, Clara Holdings grew from a small consultancy into a respected name. My days became a blur of negotiations, contracts, and late-night strategy sessions. There were moments of exhaustion, yes, but beneath the fatigue was a steady current of satisfaction. Every deal I closed felt like one more nail in the coffin of the world that once mocked my mother. My name appeared in business magazines, sometimes alongside the very families who once strutted through that charity hall decades ago. I smiled when I saw those headlines, but I never sought public attention. The best kind of revenge, I had learned, was power without spectacle. Still, I couldn't ignore the irony when I began hearing rumors about the Hendersons again. Their fortune, it seemed, was faltering. The empire that had once stood untouchable was creaking under debt and mismanagement. Their name, once spoken with envy, was now whispered with pity. I listened quietly, my mind calculating possibilities. Life, it seemed, had finally started to tilt the scales. One evening, as I sat in my office reviewing quarterly reports, my assistant mentioned a potential acquisition, an old textile subsidiary looking for investors. I glanced at the file and froze. The name at the top of the document was impossible to miss: Henderson Textiles. For a moment, the room seemed to shrink around me. I leaned back, exhaling slowly, realizing that fate had delivered something I could never have planned so perfectly. All these years, I had built my empire brick by brick, with patience, precision, and silence. And now, the very family that had destroyed my mother's life was about to knock on my door for salvation. I closed the file with a calm that surprised even me, the faintest smile tugging at my lips. Fate, I thought, had a wicked sense of timing. 15 years had passed since that night when my mother's dignity had been ripped apart in front of strangers. 15 years since I'd watched laughter echo in a hall that turned her heart to stone. In those years, the world had changed, and so had I. I was no longer the seamstress's daughter people once dismissed. I had become Margaret Clark, a name that moved quietly through the financial world, whispered with respect in rooms where real power was traded. Clara Holdings had expanded into a national firm, investing in logistics, real estate, and manufacturing. I had learned to navigate markets like maps of human greed, and I was good at it, frighteningly good. People trusted my instincts, unaware they had been sharpened by pain and revenge rather than privilege or luck. It was an ordinary Wednesday morning when the first headline appeared: Henderson Enterprises faces financial crisis. The name caught my eye like a spark in dry grass. I read the article slowly, absorbing each line like poetry. Decades of arrogance had finally caught up with them: failed investments, internal corruption, bad leadership. Their textile division, once the pride of their empire, was drowning in debt. The same industry my mother had served with her bare hands was now their downfall. I didn't smile at first. I just sat there, staring at the screen, letting the irony soak in. But when I finally did smile, it was the kind of smile you give when you recognize destiny unfolding right on schedule. I followed the story quietly over the next few weeks. Reporters painted pictures of panic factory closures, unpaid workers, lawsuits piling up. For the first time, the Hendersons were vulnerable. Their grand parties were gone, their reputation reduced to gossip fodder. I could almost hear Mrs. Henderson's voice cracking under the weight of reality. I thought about how she had once stood above my mother, dripping in jewelry, accusing her of theft, and I wondered if she remembered that moment now as she watched her own fortune disappear. I had long learned that revenge was best served cold and calculated. I wasn't going to storm into their downfall, waving a flag of triumph. I would walk in quietly, invisible until it was too late for them to recover. So, I began planning. I spent evenings poring over public filings, tracing their debts, understanding where their assets lay vulnerable. It was a puzzle, and I'd always loved puzzles. My analysts thought it was just another acquisition strategy. They had no idea that every spreadsheet on my desk was a blueprint for vengeance. When the bankruptcy auctions were finally announced, I didn't attend as Margaret Clark. That name had too much weight, too much visibility. Instead, I revived a pseudonym I'd used for discreet deals in the past: M. Clark. The initial gave me anonymity, the surname gave me continuity. No one would connect it to the girl from that small town or the woman who now held meetings in skyscrapers. Under M. Clark, I became the kind of investor the Hendersons would never suspect: faceless, efficient, interested only in numbers. The auction took place in an elegant downtown conference hall. The kind of place where fortunes are quietly redistributed behind polite smiles. I wore a simple black suit, my hair tied back, my demeanor calm. Across the room, I spotted Vanessa Henderson, their daughter, now in her late 30s. She looked composed but tense, her confident expression cracked by worry. Gone was the carelessness of wealth I remembered from my teenage years when she'd followed her mother's example of superiority. Time had humbled her. I stayed in the background, listening as their lawyers tried to charm investors, promising returns they couldn't guarantee. Piece by piece, their empire went under the hammer reel. Estate, manufacturing plants, shares in small subsidiaries. I raised my bidding paddle at the right moments, never overplaying my hand. My offers were conservative enough to appear routine yet strong enough to win. The process was mechanical, but for me, each victory was personal. When the final gavel hit the podium, Clara Holdings had acquired 3 of their most valuable assets discreetly, cleanly, and legally. No one in that room realized what had just happened. I had taken the first chunk of their legacy, and it was only the beginning. As the crowd dispersed, I caught a glimpse of Vanessa shaking hands with potential investors, her forced smile barely holding. Her father, once a dominant presence in business circles, was nowhere to be seen, rumored to be ill, some said. Mrs. Henderson was also absent. I imagined her sitting in a quiet estate somewhere, nursing pride that had finally met its match. I wondered if she still wore jewelry to breakfast. The thought made me almost laugh. Back at my office, I sat alone in the dim light, reviewing the contracts I'd signed that day. The documents bore my pseudonym, not my true name. To the world, M. Clark was just another anonymous player in the corporate feeding frenzy. But to me, Those papers were symbolic, the first tangible steps of a promise I had made at 15, standing beside my broken mother. I placed the folder on my desk and traced my fingers over the embossed seal of Henderson Enterprises. "You took her dignity," I whispered softly. "Now I'll take your legacy." Over the following months, my acquisitions drew no suspicion. Business journalists speculated about a mysterious investor who seemed to have a particular interest in the Henderson collapse. Some said it was a rival conglomerate. Others guessed a foreign syndicate. I let the rumors swirl. Secrecy had always been my strongest asset. While the Hendersons tried to salvage what remained of their brand, I was already planning my next move, a merger proposal that would put me at the center of their recovery plan. I didn't want to destroy them outright. I wanted them to come to me for help. I wanted them to rely on me, to sign documents they didn't read, to believe salvation had arrived, never realizing that the hand they were shaking belonged to the daughter of the woman they had ruined. There's a peculiar satisfaction in silence, in knowing that your enemies are falling without realizing who's pulling the strings. Each day that passed, I grew more certain of my path. But beneath that certainty, something unexpected stirred. I found myself thinking about my mother more than usual, wondering if she'd approve of what I was doing. She had always believed in grace, in dignity, even amid pain. I tried to convince myself that I was honoring her, not betraying her values. After all, I wasn't hurting anyone who didn't deserve it. I was just leveling the scales. When the Hendersons finally reached out for private talks with M. Clark, I knew the time had come. Their polite email was a thin veil over desperation, the language of people used to commanding, now forced to ask. My assistant handed me the message with a knowing smile. "They're asking for a meeting," she said. I nodded, hiding the tremor of satisfaction in my chest. "Tell them," I said, "that M. Clark will consider it." As I watched the city skyline from my office window that night, lights flickering like tiny confessions, I knew the game had truly begun. I had waited 15 years for this moment, and everything was falling perfectly into place. But even then, a small whisper of caution echoed somewhere deep inside me that the line between justice and obsession can be invisible until you've crossed it. Still, I silenced that voice. This was not the time for doubt. It was time to finish what I started. And as fate would soon prove, I wasn't done yet. I wanted them to kneel. The email from the Hendersons arrived early on a Monday morning. Even after all the months of quiet maneuvering, seeing their name in my inbox sent a strange tremor through me, not fear, but something sharper, colder. They addressed the message to M. Clark, the faceless investor they believed could rescue them from ruin. Their tone was polite yet desperate. The kind of formality that hides humiliation. They wanted a meeting to discuss a potential partnership that might stabilize what little remained of their business empire. I leaned back in my chair, rereading their words, and let a small smile form. The time had finally come for them to come to me unknowingly. I replied through my assistant, keeping the communication deliberately distant. All correspondence would go through intermediaries. M. Clark remained invisible, a name with influence but no face. I made sure our negotiations appeared purely transactional, a simple exchange of opportunity. Behind that illusion, however, every document, every clause, every subtle revision was a step toward something far more personal. The Hendersons, once proud and selective about whom they worked with, were now too cornered to question their savior's anonymity. Their desperation was my cover. As the weeks passed, I watched from afar as they struggled to maintain the last shreds of their old grandeur. Their once grand estate had lost its shine. News articles spoke of unpaid taxes and staff layoffs. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman who had laughed while accusing my mother of theft, now appeared in the business columns pleading for investor confidence. Her pride, once polished and poisonous, had eroded into something almost pitiable. I followed their story through financial reports, online features, and quiet updates from industry contacts. Each piece of information fed a deep, quiet satisfaction that I tried not to show, even to myself. The negotiations were handled by Vanessa Henderson, their daughter. She was older now, in her late 30s, and the weight of failure had etched lines of tension into her face. I watched recordings of her press conferences and interviews. The proud tilt of her chin remained, but her eyes gave her away. Pride without stability is nothing but fear in disguise. She was trying to project composure, but I could sense the panic beneath her professionalism. And I recognized that panic because I had once lived with it too. Through my intermediaries, I began sending proposals carefully worded, generously framed offers that seemed designed to save them but in truth only deepened their dependency. The documents were intricate webs of clauses, each one crafted to transfer gradual control of their assets to Clara Holdings. Every paragraph was legal, ethical, even benevolent on paper, yet it all led to one undeniable outcome. Piece by piece, the Hendersons were signing away everything they still owned. They believed they were protecting themselves from collapse, but what they were really doing was handing me the keys to their kingdom. My assistant Jenna was the only one who knew the full truth. She had been with me since the early days, loyal, sharp, and discreet. The first time she realized who M. Clark really was, she looked at me differently, not with judgment, but with quiet awe. "You're really going to do this?" she asked one evening as we reviewed a new contract draft. I nodded without hesitation. "They destroyed everything my mother stood for," I told her. "This isn't just business, Jenna. This is balance." She didn't question me again, but I sometimes caught her studying me with the cautious respect one gives to a force they can't quite categorize. Weeks turned into months, and my plan unfolded flawlessly. Each new agreement expanded M. Clark's influence while shrinking theirs. Their factories, once symbols of their success, were now partially owned by me. Their shares in smaller companies had been transferred under the guise of partnership restructuring. Their properties, including several rental estates, were now technically collateral against the investments I'd made. It was like watching a powerful ship sink slowly, unaware of the hole beneath its hull. And still, no one suspected who held the rope. From my office, I kept tabs on their every move. Vanessa worked tirelessly to maintain appearances, attending conferences, giving interviews, and negotiating with false confidence. Her mother, however, had disappeared from public view entirely. There were whispers of illness, though no one could confirm it. I sometimes wondered if she ever thought about my mother, about that night so long ago when humiliation seemed so easy to inflict. I imagined her sitting in a quiet room surrounded by fading photographs and wondering where everything had gone wrong. There was a grim satisfaction in knowing the answer was me, though they would never realize it. The deeper I went, the more careful I became. The walls between Margaret Clark and M. Clark had to remain impenetrable. My communications were encrypted, my legal teams separated by layers of intermediaries. Even within Clara Holdings, only Jenna and 2 senior partners knew of my pseudonym. To everyone else, M. Clark was just another high-level investor based overseas. The secrecy wasn't just protection, it was power. There's something intoxicating about being unseen yet omnipresent, about pulling strings while others bow to a ghost. One afternoon, as I sat reviewing a final merger draft, Jenna entered with a file and an unreadable expression. "Vanessa has requested a direct meeting," she said, placing the file on my desk. My pen froze mid-signature. For a moment, the air felt heavy, as if the ghosts of 2 worlds had collided in that single sentence. "A meeting?" I repeated. Jenna nodded. "In person. She says she won't finalize anything without meeting M. Clark face to face." I leaned back, hiding my mane, each reaction behind a neutral smile. The possibility of exposure flickered in my mind, but so did an odd thrill. Vanessa was bold just like her mother, but sharper, more cautious. It made sense that she'd want to look her benefactor in the eye before surrendering what remained of her family's legacy. "And she doesn't suspect anything?" I asked. Jenna shook her head. "Not at all. She believes M. Clark is a middle-aged investor from Boston. We've kept your identity airtight." I sat quietly for a while, running my fingers over the edge of the file. A part of me wanted to refuse, to maintain the safety of distance. But another part, the part that had waited years for acknowledgement, craved that confrontation. I wanted to see her face when she realized who I was. I wanted to look into her eyes and measure if she had inherited her mother's arrogance or learned humility from failure. Set it up, I said finally. But make sure it's controlled. Neutral ground. No surprises. Jenna nodded, already understanding the unspoken gravity of the moment. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about how far I'd come from a girl, standing helpless beside her disgraced mother, to the invisible hand guiding an empire's collapse. I should have felt triumphant. But instead, there was an unfamiliar tightness in my chest. Revenge, even when earned, can feel heavy. But there was no turning back now. The moment I'd imagined for years was finally within reach, and I wasn't going to let hesitation spoil it. The next morning, as the sun cast pale light across the city skyline, I stood by my office window and watched the world move below. Somewhere out there, Vanessa Henderson was preparing for a meeting she believed could save her family. She didn't know she was walking straight into the hands of the daughter of the woman they once destroyed. And as I turned away from the glass, I felt a cold certainty settle over me. The game of masks was almost over. The hunter was about to step into the light, until the day Vanessa insisted on meeting me face to face. The meeting was set for a Thursday afternoon at the Grand Halden Hotel, one of those places where wealth lingers in the air like perfume. The chandeliers glittered too brightly, and the lobby smelled faintly of roses and polished ambition. I arrived early, as I always did. Control was a habit I had perfected long before success ever found me. My reflection in the elevator doors looked composed, tailored navy suit, hair tied neatly, minimal jewelry. But beneath the surface, my heart pulsed with a rhythm I hadn't felt in years. This was the moment I had been walking toward for most of my life. And yet, I found myself rehearsing words that refused to feel satisfying. How do you prepare to meet the face of a family that destroyed your mother's life? The private meeting room on the 21st floor overlooked the city. I chose a chair that allowed me to face the door. Jenna was beside me, calm but alert, ensuring all documentation and files were ready. Everything had been arranged perfectly: security, timing, even the temperature of the room. The only unpredictable element left was emotion. I had spent my career eliminating unpredictability, yet here I was, waiting for it to walk through that door wearing the Henderson name. When the door finally opened, I felt a flicker of something that startled me. It wasn't hatred, at least, not entirely. Vanessa Henderson stepped inside, dressed impeccably in a cream suit that looked expensive but carefully understated. She carried the kind of poise that money teaches and hardship refines. Her expression was polite, professional, but her eyes betrayed the fatigue of someone holding an empire together with trembling hands. For a brief moment, I saw her not as an enemy but as a woman haunted by a legacy of arrogance she hadn't created but had inherited. Still, the past refused to loosen its grip. My throat tightened as she extended her hand. "Miss Clark," she said, her tone steady but her fingers trembling slightly. "Thank you for agreeing to meet me. You're our only hope." I took her hand, holding it longer than necessary, my eyes searching her face. "You have no idea how true that is," I replied. She smiled faintly, misinterpreting my words as reassurance. I let her believe that for now. The meeting began with small talk and numbers. Vanessa was sharp. She knew her business inside out. She spoke about restructuring, projections, possible joint ventures, the language of someone fighting to stay afloat. I listened carefully, asking pointed questions, each one designed to test her composure. She was intelligent, but desperation had dulled her instincts. I could see how much she needed this deal, how much pride she'd already sacrificed just to get this far. As she talked, my mind wandered back to that night so long ago, my mother standing in Henderson's grand hall, humiliated and helpless, surrounded by the laughter of people who thought themselves untouchable. For years, I had imagined this exact moment, dreamed of watching one of them plead for help from me. Now that it was real, the satisfaction was quieter than I expected. Revenge, I realized, was not always a roar. Sometimes it was the soft exhale of long-contained truth. Vanessa slid a stack of documents across the table. "These are the proposed amendments," she said, her tone confident. "We believe this partnership could be mutually beneficial." I took my time scanning the pages, though I already knew every line. My legal team had written most of them. It was a strange power sitting across from the daughter of the woman who had once fired my mother in disgrace, knowing she was now offering me her family's future without understanding who I was. "Your offer is acceptable," I said finally, signing my initials beside the printed name M. Clark. Vanessa exhaled in visible relief. For the first time, I saw the tension leave her shoulders. "You have no idea how much this means to us," she murmured, her voice trembling slightly. "My mother's health is declining, and she can't take much more of this." Her words pierced through my composure. Mrs. Henderson, the same woman whose cold eyes I would never forget, was sick. A part of me felt a flicker of pity, but it quickly turned into something harder, more defensive. I couldn't allow empathy to weaken the edge I'd spent years sharpening. "I'm sure this partnership will benefit both sides," I said, my tone measured. But inside, my thoughts were less restrained. Benefit? For you, it's survival. For me, it's justice. As the meeting neared its end, I realized how strange it was that Vanessa had no clue who sat before her. I had built an entire empire while remaining invisible to the very people whose scorn had shaped me. My mother's name, my hometown, even my voice all hidden beneath layers of reinvention. I had become what they could never imagine. A woman they'd underestimated, transformed by their cruelty into someone untouchable. Vanessa gathered her documents, preparing to leave. "I'll inform my mother that we have secured your support," she said with a grateful smile. "She'll be relieved. She always believed help would come if we just held on." Her words hung in the air like an unfinished sentence. I couldn't let them be the last. Something inside me, pride, pain, maybe defiance, refused to stay silent any longer. I reached for my glasses and removed them, setting them deliberately on the table. "Vanessa," I said softly. She looked up, puzzled. "It's Margaret." For a moment, confusion flickered across her face, then recognition dawned like a slow dawning storm. Her eyes widened, her lips parted slightly, and all the color drained from her cheeks. "Margaret," she whispered. "Margaret Clark? I remember you. You're the seamstress's daughter." I finished for her, my voice calm but edged with steel. "Yes, the one your mother accused of theft by bloodline." Silence filled the room, thick and unbreathing. Vanessa stared at me, her professional composure dissolving. "Your mother," she began, but I raised a hand, cutting her off. "She deserved better," I said quietly. "Better than humiliation, better than the cruelty she endured at your family's hands." Vanessa's eyes shimmered, torn between guilt and disbelief. "I was just a child," she said softly. "I didn't understand what my mother had done." "I know," I replied. "That's why I'm here, not to destroy you, but to remind you how easily power changes hands." I leaned forward slightly. "This partnership will continue, but under my terms." Her jaw tightened as she nodded, the realization of her new position sinking in. She wasn't dealing with a savior anymore. She was facing the consequence of generations of entitlement. I gathered my papers, slid them into my briefcase, and stood. As I reached the door, Vanessa's voice stopped me. "You could ruin us completely," she said, her voice trembling. "Why haven't you?" I turned to look at her one last time. "Because I'm not your mother," I said. "And because some lessons are worth teaching slowly." Then I left the room, leaving Vanessa Henderson sitting alone in a silence that must have felt awfully familiar, the same silence my mother once endured. The balance had shifted. But the story wasn't over yet. For the first time in years, the past had a face again. And it was looking right back at me. I told her this partnership would continue under my terms. When I revealed my true identity to Vanessa, I expected anger, denial, maybe even defiance. What I didn't expect was silence. She sat there, her face pale and her lips pressed tightly, together, like she was holding back every apology her mother never gave. I could see her trying to find the right words, but none came. That silence told me everything she understood. And in that understanding, the first stone of her family's pride finally cracked. I didn't gloat. I didn't smile. I simply told her the truth. There were only two choices left for the Hendersons' employment under Clara Holdings, or total bankruptcy. The next morning, Vanessa called. Her voice was stripped of the confidence it once held, reduced to something almost fragile. "We'll accept your terms," she said. "My mother agrees." That single statement carried the weight of decades. Pride, that golden curse her family had lived by, was gone. And I knew then that revenge had taken on a new form, not destruction, but domination through quiet control. I decided to place them where they would feel the full measure of humility without stripping them of dignity. Revenge should never resemble cruelty. It should resemble justice that finally found its voice. I made Vanessa the operations manager at one of my textile factories, the same industry that once defined her family's fortune. The irony wasn't lost on either of us. She would oversee production lines, supervise staff, report to people who had no idea who she used to be. I wanted her to understand the grind my mother endured, the long hours, the endless labor, the constant expectation of perfection. But unlike her mother, I would never raise my voice or accuse her unfairly. She would work, and she would learn. As for Mrs. Henderson, I offered her a consultancy position under probation. Her title sounded respectable on paper, but it was more symbolic than substantial. She would advise on outdated textile techniques, a polite way of saying she'd watch others innovate where her influence had long expired. The terms were clear. She would report directly to me. There were no grand offices, no chauffeurs, no special privileges. If she wanted to work, she would arrive like everyone else on time, prepared, accountable. When they both showed up for their first day, the factory floor buzzed with quiet curiosity. No one recognized them as the once untouchable Hendersons. To the employees, they were just new hires, another pair of women trying to rebuild their lives. I watched from my office window as Vanessa adjusted her ID badge, her chin lifted slightly as if clinging to the last shreds of her old world. Her mother stood beside her, smaller somehow, her hands clasped nervously. That image, the proud reduced to ordinary, should have filled me with satisfaction, and for a fleeting moment, it did. I treated them professionally, nothing more, nothing less. They attended every staff meeting, filled out performance reports, and answered to supervisors who didn't know or care about their lineage. I made no special mention of them in public. Their humiliation wasn't for display. It was private, methodical, and purposeful. If revenge was a lesson, then this was the curriculum. Every task they completed, every instruction they followed, was a silent echo of the day my mother was told she wasn't worthy of standing among the powerful. The employees at Clara Holdings adored the workplace culture, inclusive, fair, driven by empathy. Most of my staff were single mothers or women rebuilding their lives after hardship. I never told them the story behind the company's name or the quiet vendetta woven into its success. To them, I was just a strong leader who cared deeply about justice and equality. And perhaps that's what I had become, even if my motives had started elsewhere. Vanessa adapted faster than I expected. She worked long hours, asked questions, and learned the business with genuine effort. Sometimes, when I walked through the factory unannounced, I'd find her sleeves rolled up, talking to the seamstresses, her tone patient and respectful. I noticed the way she lingered on the details, the stitching patterns, the machinery maintenance, as if trying to absorb the world her family had once exploited. There was humility in her gestures now, something her mother had never possessed. Mrs. Henderson, however, was slower to adjust. She struggled with the loss of status, often standing apart during meetings, her silence a mixture of confusion and shame. I kept our interactions professional. Once, during a quarterly review, she lingered in my office after everyone else had left. "I never imagined I'd work for you," she said quietly. I looked up from my papers, her frail voice, a ghost from a past I'd buried deep. "Life has a way of returning favors," I replied. She nodded slowly, her eyes glistening, but said nothing more. For the first time, I saw not the cruel matriarch of my memories, but an old woman weighed down by consequences she couldn't escape. Weeks turned into months, and the Hendersons began to settle into their new reality. They were punctual, polite, diligent. The staff grew to like Vanessa for her efficiency and Mrs. Henderson for her quiet grace. Neither of them mentioned the past, though I knew it lingered between us in every conversation, every polite exchange. It wasn't forgiveness that passed between us, but understanding the fragile kind that doesn't erase wounds but acknowledges them. And yet, something unexpected began to stir inside me. Watching them work didn't bring the sense of triumph I had always imagined. Instead, I felt a strange emptiness, a quiet ache that refused to fade. I had everything: success, control, vindication, yet when I saw Vanessa helping a struggling worker lift a heavy box or Mrs. Henderson staying late to correct reports, I realized I was no longer angry. My revenge had achieved its purpose, but in doing so, it had stripped me of the emotion that once fueled me. One evening, after the factory closed, I walked the floor alone. The hum of machines had faded, leaving only the faint smell of cotton and oil. I stopped by the workstation where Vanessa had left her notes. Her handwriting was neat, her comments encouraging, thoughtful. A single line at the bottom caught my eye. Everyone deserves a second chance, no matter their mistakes. I stood there for a long time, the words blurring as memories of my mother flooded back her calm voice. Her quiet grace, her refusal to let hatred define her. The irony was almost unbearable. I had built an empire from anger, yet the legacy I was now creating was one my mother would have built from compassion. The realization didn't break me, but it shook me. For years, I had believed revenge would heal the wound left by that night of humiliation. But standing there, surrounded by everything I had achieved, I finally understood the truth. Revenge didn't heal anything. It only uncovered deeper scars I had refused to acknowledge. The next morning, as the factory came alive again, I watched Vanessa and her mother walk in together. They greeted the guards, smiled at the workers, and disappeared into the flow of ordinary life. They were no longer the Hendersons who once ruled the town. They were just people trying to rebuild. And for the first time, I didn't feel the need to remind them of who I was or what they had done. But even as I turned away, something inside me whispered a painful truth: I had won the war, but I hadn't found peace. Because revenge didn't heal me, it only exposed a deeper wound. There comes a time when victory begins to lose its taste. Mine used to be sweet, sharp, and satisfying like the first sip of justice after years of drought. But somewhere along the line, that sweetness began to fade, replaced by a hollow, quiet I couldn't explain. The Hendersons now worked for me. Humbled, changed, and obedient. The world had turned full circle, and every person who had once laughed at my mother's humiliation now whispered my name with respect. I should have felt complete. But instead, a strange heaviness began to settle in my chest, a question I had avoided for far too long. What had all of this truly cost me? I started visiting my mother's grave more often. The cemetery sat on a gentle hill outside my hometown, where the wind always seemed to hum through the tall grass. The headstone was simple, carved from white stone with her name, Clara Dawson, etched softly into its surface. Every time I came, I brought her lilies, her favorite, and sat by the grave, talking to her like she could hear every word. I told her everything, every victory, every setback, every tear I hadn't allowed anyone else to see. I told her about the Hendersons, about how I had finally made them kneel not through cruelty, but through consequence. Yet standing there, I didn't feel triumphant. I felt small. The empire I had built, the one that bore her name, couldn't fill the void left by that one day of humiliation. I had built walls of glass and steel, stacked titles and achievements like trophies. And still, when I stood by that grave, I was just her daughter again. The same girl who had watched her mother's tears fall to the floor as people laughed. The same girl who swore revenge instead of peace. I began to see my mother differently then. Not as the victim I had spent my life avenging, but as a woman who had chosen grace when she could have chosen hate. Maybe she had understood something I never had: that vengeance, no matter how well earned, was a heavy thing to carry. I imagined her sitting across from me, shaking her head with that patient smile. "You've done enough, Maggie," she would have said. "Let it rest now." But I didn't know how to rest. For years, my purpose had been my armor, and without it, I wasn't sure who I was. In the months that followed, I began changing how I worked. I started mentoring young women, especially those who reminded me of my mother, single mothers, widows, women overlooked by society. I taught them how to manage finances, how to stand tall in boardrooms, how to never let someone else define their worth. For the first time, I felt something purer than satisfaction. I felt pride, not in what I'd built, but in what I was giving. Every time one of those women succeeded, I saw a fragment of my mother smiling through them. Her kindness, her endurance, her quiet strength they lived on, just not in the way I had expected. Vanessa, too, began to change. She was no longer the polished, fearful woman I had met in that hotel. Working alongside ordinary people had softened her. She spoke differently now, humbler, gentler. She had learned to listen instead of command. Slowly, she began taking initiative in community projects through Clara Holdings, offering free training to local women, advocating for fair labor conditions. Sometimes, I would catch her speaking to workers on the floor, her sleeves rolled up, her laughter easy. It was a strange sight, a Henderson moving among those her family had once dismissed. It happened one night after everyone had gone home. I was still in my office, going over a proposal, when I heard a knock on the door. "Come in," I said, expecting Jenna. But it was Vanessa. Her eyes were red, her face streaked with tears. She hesitated in the doorway before walking in. "I'm sorry to disturb you," she began, "but I needed to say something." I gestured for her to sit, though she remained standing, her hands twisting nervously. "I was cruel," she said quietly. "When I was younger, to people, to staff, to anyone I thought was beneath me. My mother taught me that she taught me pride before she ever taught me compassion. She looked up at me then, eyes glistening. But you taught me something else. You didn't destroy us. You could have, and you didn't. You showed me what humility feels like and what it means to earn forgiveness, even when you don't deserve it." Her words caught me off guard. I didn't respond right away. For years, I had imagined the Hendersons' apology, but I had never imagined it sounding so sincere. She continued, her voice trembling. "I know saying sorry can't undo anything, but I needed to tell you that your mother didn't deserve what she went through. I've spent months thinking about her, about that story you told me. And I've been trying to make things right not just for you, but for her. I felt something inside me loosen, something I hadn't realized was still clenched tight." I stood up and walked to the window, watching the city lights blur into gold streaks across the glass. "It's strange," I said softly, turning to her. "I built this company to make the world pay for what it did to her, and somewhere along the way, I forgot what she would have wanted." Vanessa stepped closer, her expression filled with something I hadn't expected: respect. "I think she'd be proud of you," she said. "But maybe she'd want you to rest now." Her words echoed my mother's imagined voice perfectly. I didn't reply, but as Vanessa left my office that night, I felt a quiet shift within me. Something that had been burning for decades finally began to cool. The fire that had once driven me now flickered softly, transforming into something gentler: compassion. Over the following weeks, I found myself thinking less about revenge and more about legacy. The empire I had built no longer felt like a monument to pain but a bridge to healing. The Hendersons continued to work diligently, and I noticed how my staff treated them with kindness, not curiosity. The story of who they were had faded into irrelevance. All that mattered now was who they were becoming. And for me, that realization changed everything. I started to see that vengeance had served its purpose. It had given me strength when I had begursony, none. Focus when I was lost. But it was never meant to be my destination. It was merely the road that led me to understanding. I began to forgive them not because they deserved it, but because I deserved peace. One afternoon, while leaving the office, I stopped by the old framed photograph on my wall, my mother standing in front of her sewing machine, smiling. "I think I understand now," I whispered. "Revenge gave me power, but forgiveness, it gives me peace." The words felt foreign and true at the same time. The weight that had lived on my shoulders for years began to lift, little by little, like a storm finally breaking after decades of thunder. "So, I did something even I never expected. It's strange how the heart knows when a story has reached its end, not when revenge is fulfilled, but when peace finally takes its place. Months passed since Vanessa's late-night confession, and the quiet between us had shifted from tension to understanding. The Hendersons continued to work diligently under Clara Holdings, their humility no longer forced but genuine. My days were filled with productivity and calm, yet something inside me urged for more, not another victory, but a conclusion. A way to close the circle my life had drawn around this one family and the pain they had caused. I didn't want their downfall anymore. I wanted transformation for them, for me, and for the legacy of my mother, Clara Dawson. It began one morning when I visited the foundation department of my company. We had been discussing new programs for women returning to the workforce, and I realized how deeply this mission aligned with everything I once wished for my mother. She never got a second chance, never received the kindness or opportunity she deserved. That thought lingered for days, tugging at me until the idea became impossible to ignore. I decided to start a new initiative, something bigger than a business venture, a foundation that would help women rebuild their lives through employment, education, and empowerment. I named it the Clara Project. But I knew that if it was to mean something, truly mean something, I had to make an extraordinary choice. Forgiveness, I had learned, is not weakness, it's the rarest form of courage. So, I did what no one, not even Jenna, could have predicted. I offered the Hendersons full partnership in the Clara Project. When I first proposed it, the room fell into stunned silence. Vanessa's eyes widened in disbelief, and Mrs. Henderson, frail but still dignified, simply shook her head. "You can't be serious," Vanessa said, her voice a blend of confusion and fear. "After everything we've done, after what my mother did to yours." I nodded calmly. "Precisely because of that," I replied. "If this project is going to change lives, it should begin by transforming the ones that once caused harm." They refused at first, ashamed and uncertain of their worth. We don't deserve this," Mrs. Henderson said softly, her voice trembling with the weight of years gone wrong. "I spent most of my life taking more than I gave." Her honesty startled me. The arrogance that had once defined her was gone, replaced by something painfully human. I met her gaze and said quietly, "My mother would have wanted this. She never believed in vengeance, even when she had every reason to. This is her forgiveness, not mine. I'm just delivering it." The decision wasn't easy for them, but within weeks, they agreed. Together, we launched the Clara Project, a foundation aimed at creating employment and vocational training for women who had been cast aside by circumstance. We built community centers in struggling towns, opened textile training schools, and developed scholarship programs for single mothers who dreamed of independence. The project spread faster than any of us anticipated, drawing attention from media outlets and philanthropists alike. The public saw 3 women leading a revolutionary social cause. No one knew the history that bound us together, and I preferred it that way. The world didn't need to know that this redemption had been born from revenge. Some stories are better left buried beneath compassion. Working alongside the Hendersons felt surreal at first. Vanessa handled logistics with remarkable skill. She had grown into a woman who understood the value of humility and effort. Mrs. Henderson, though older and slower, found meaning in mentoring younger women at the training centers. I watched her teaching sewing techniques to widows and single mothers, her once perfect manicured hands now guiding trembling fingers with patience. It was ironic and poetic. She was finally giving what she once denied my mother: respect. One afternoon, I visited one of our centers outside the city. The air smelled faintly of cotton and lavender detergent, just like the workshop my mother used to work in. As I walked through the rows of sewing machines, I saw Vanessa laughing with a group of trainees, her sleeves rolled up, her hair loose and windblown. For the first time, I felt no resentment, no old pain creeping into my thoughts. I realized that vengeance had served its purpose. It had brought us all to this point, where the past could finally rest. As the months went by, the Clara Project became the most meaningful part of my career. The empire I had built for power now became a bridge for others to cross into new beginnings. The fire that had fueled me for decades finally dimmed, replaced by something warmer, steadier contentment. I no longer saw the Hendersons as my enemies. They were my partners, my unexpected allies in the journey toward closure. One evening, after the grand opening of our third center, Vanessa approached me on the balcony overlooking the city. The glow of the streetlights reflected in her eyes as she said, "You could have destroyed us, Margaret. You had every reason to. Instead, you gave us purpose. I don't know how to thank you." I looked at her for a long moment before replying, "Don't thank me. Thank my mother. She's the reason I didn't let hate win." Vanessa nodded, her expression thoughtful. "Then I hope we make her proud." That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept thinking about my mother, her voice, her laughter, her resilience. I decided to visit her grave the next morning. The air was crisp and gentle, carrying the faint scent of blooming lilies. I placed fresh flowers by her headstone and knelt, resting my hand against the cool marble. "It's done now, Mama," I whispered. "The ones who hurt you, they work for us now. But more importantly, they've learned." My voice trembled, not from sadness but from release. I thought revenge would make me powerful, but it only made me restless. Forgiveness, that's what set me free. For a long time, I sat there, letting the silence wash over me. The sun broke through the clouds, warming my face, and I imagined it was her hand, the same gentle touch that once soothed my fears. I smiled, realizing that this was the peace she had always wanted for me. The peace she had carried in her heart even when the world was cruel. When I left the cemetery, I didn't look back. Some chapters deserve to be closed with grace, not grief. I knew that from that day forward, my mother's name would no longer be a symbol of sorrow but of strength. The Clara Project would continue to grow, changing lives quietly and profoundly, a legacy built not on revenge, but on forgiveness. Now, when I stand in front of my employees, when I see women lifting themselves out of despair through the opportunities we've created, I feel my mother everywhere, in the light, in the laughter, in the calm after the storm. The Hendersons and I rarely talk about the past anymore. We don't need to. It's written in every act of kindness, every project completed, it's every hand extended instead of withdrawn. My life circle was complete. What began as a daughter's vow of vengeance ended as a woman's act of grace. And as I look back on the journey that shaped me, the pain, the power, the lessons, I know this to be true. Revenge made me powerful. Forgiveness made me free. In the end, I realized revenge had never truly been about making them suffer. It was about reclaiming the dignity they stole from my mother. The Hendersons learned humility, and I learned peace. The empire I built no longer stood as proof of power, but as a monument to forgiveness. My mother's name now lives in every woman we've helped rise again. Because in the end, revenge made me powerful, but forgiveness made me free. If my story touched your heart, don't forget to share it. Maybe someone out there needs to hear that forgiveness can be stronger than revenge. And if you believe dignity always finds its way back, leave a like and stay with me for more stories that remind us of life's quiet justice. But tell me, if you were in my place that day, would you have forgiven them or made them feel every ounce of the pain they caused?